What happens when a decades-old fighter jet from Venezuela crosses paths with one of the world's most advanced US Navy destroyers? And what if the President of the United States openly authorizes his commanders to shoot that jet down? This isn't a hypothetical, it's the tense reality unfolding in the Caribbean today, where US-Venezuela relations have reached one of their most dangerous points in recent memory. This video dives into the question, will Trump really shoot down Maduro's F-16? And what could that mean for the future of the region? The timeline begins with a deadly US military action on September 2nd, 2025. A US Navy helicopter strike targeted a vessel in the southern Caribbean, which Washington claimed was being used by the Tren de Aragua, Venezuela's most notorious criminal cartel. The strike killed 11 people. The Pentagon framed it as part of a larger anti-narco-terrorism campaign. But in Caracas, the attack was viewed as a direct violation of sovereignty. Just days later, on September 4th, tensions flared further. Two Venezuelan F-16 fighter jets carried out a low, close pass near the USS Jason Dunham, a US Navy destroyer operating in international waters. According to the Pentagon, these maneuvers brought the Venezuelan jets within weapons range of the American warship, a move they called highly provocative. CBS reported that this was not a single flyover, but a second pass as well, suggesting a pattern of intimidation or testing of US resolve. Importantly, the destroyer chose not to engage, but the message from Caracas was unmistakable. Venezuela was willing to challenge US forces head-on. The response from Washington came directly from the top. President Donald Trump, speaking just hours after the Pentagon's confirmation, declared that US commanders in the Caribbean were now fully authorized to shoot down Venezuelan aircraft if they threatened US forces. His exact words, "If they do put us in a dangerous position, they'll be shot down." This distinction matters. Trump did not issue a standing order to shoot on sight. Rather, he gave his commanders authority to act preemptively if they believed danger was imminent. Still, in political and military terms, this statement represents a sharp escalation. For years, US warships and Venezuelan aircraft have shadowed each other, sometimes at uncomfortably close distances, but rarely has the White House been so blunt about the possibility of lethal force. Trump's choice of words was calculated to send two messages, one to the Venezuelan government and one to his domestic audience. To Maduro, it was a warning, test our resolve and you may lose jets. To his American base, it reinforced the narrative of strength, deterrence and toughness on narco-terrorism. Parallel to these statements, the US military presence in the Caribbean is being significantly reinforced. The Pentagon confirmed that 10 F-35 stealth fighters have been deployed to Puerto Rico. Why does this matter? First, it shifts the balance of air power dramatically. Venezuela's Air Force operates legacy F-16AB fighters, many acquired in the 1980s. They lack modern sensors, stealth and long-range detection systems. In contrast, the F-35 represents the pinnacle of fifth-generation technology, able to detect and track threats long before it is even visible to enemy radar. Second, the deployment is symbolic. By stationing stealth jets in Puerto Rico, a US territory close to Venezuelan airspace, the administration is signaling that this is not just about drug cartels, it is about geopolitical deterrence. The destroyer USS Jason Dunham is also no ordinary ship. As an Arleigh Burke-class Aegis destroyer, it is capable of advanced missile defense, long-range surveillance and precision strikes. The presence of such a vessel in the Caribbean during this tense moment underscores Washington's willingness to project overwhelming force if challenged. So how has Venezuela reacted? President Nicolas Maduro has chosen a carefully balanced strategy. On one hand, he denounced the US strike on the Venezuelan-linked boat, calling it an act of aggression and demanding that Washington respect sovereignty. He also emphasized, "I respect Trump." None of the differences we've had can lead to a military conflict. This line may surprise some observers. By expressing respect for Trump, Maduro is signaling that he does not want to provoke a full-scale confrontation. It is an attempt at diplomacy, couched in the language of de-escalation. But Maduro also issued a stark warning. If Venezuela were attacked directly, the nation would resist with an armed struggle. He has mobilized militias, stepped up defense preparedness, and framed the US actions as evidence of Washington's long-standing desire for violent regime change. This dual strategy, calling for respect while preparing for resistance, shows that Caracas is walking a fine line. Maduro cannot appear weak domestically, especially given his history of anti-US rhetoric. Yet he also knows that Venezuela's aging military cannot win a direct confrontation with the US. Up to this point, we've laid out the core events: the US strike, the Venezuelan flyovers, Trump's warning, the F-35 deployment, and Maduro's reaction. But the real question remains, what happens next? The heart of this crisis lies in one phrase: dangerous position. When Trump authorized his commanders to shoot down Venezuelan jets if they endanger US forces, he was effectively expanding their rules of engagement. But what exactly constitutes hostile intent in military law? International rules and US naval doctrine generally allow for force if an aircraft demonstrates behavior that indicates a threat, such as flying directly toward a ship at high speed, locking radar onto a vessel, or maneuvering within weapons range without clear communication. The Venezuelan F-16s that flew near the USS Jason Dunham came close enough to be considered within weapons range, which is why the Pentagon labeled it highly provocative. But the jets reportedly did not lock on radar, did not release weapons, and eventually moved away. That distinction explains why the destroyer held fire. In other words, the difference between a provocative flyover and a shootdown can be measured in mere seconds and in the split-second judgment of a US commander on deck or in the cockpit of an F-35. With the situation so fragile, analysts are outlining three primary scenarios for what comes next. 1. De-escalation through intercepts. The most likely short-term outcome is that future Venezuelan flyovers will be intercepted by US aircraft. F-35s could shadow Venezuelan jets, forcing them to divert before they reach a US warship. This avoids a direct clash while still demonstrating US dominance in the air. 2. Warning shots and non-lethal measures. If Venezuela presses further, US commanders may use non-lethal tactics like firing flares, executing close intercept maneuvers, or even electronic jamming of Venezuelan systems. This would send a warning without crossing the irreversible line of destroying an enemy aircraft. 3. A shoot-down incident. The most dangerous possibility is that a Venezuelan jet repeats the same maneuver but adds a sign of hostile intent, such as radar lock-on or a dive profile that mimics an attack run. Under Trump's authorization, that could trigger an order to fire. If that happens, the US will almost certainly seek to frame it as self-defense in international waters. Venezuela, meanwhile, would present it as proof of US aggression, rallying domestic and international support. The result could be a spiral of escalation far beyond a single aircraft. The question of legality looms large. First, the US strike on September 2nd that killed 11 people on a Venezuelan-linked boat has already raised concerns. Washington described the target as part of the Tren de Aragua, a powerful cartel it designates as a terrorist group. That framing provides a legal justification under the authorization for use of military force against terrorist threats. But critics argue the legal basis is murky. Was the strike conducted in Venezuelan waters or international waters? Were the victims combatants or civilians? These unanswered questions could complicate Washington's defense at the United Nations or the Organization of American States, OAS. Now, if the US were to shoot down a Venezuelan state aircraft, the stakes would be even higher. Unlike striking a criminal gang's boat, this would mean direct military action against the armed forces of a sovereign state. International law allows self-defense, but proving hostile intent is always subject to interpretation. Regionally, the optics are dangerous for Washington. Leaders like Colombia's Gustavo Petro have already condemned US strikes as assassinations. Other Latin American governments may see a shootdown as proof of US imperial overreach. That could fracture alliances and weaken support for Washington's campaign against Venezuelan cartels. So where does this leave us? The next weeks will be critical, and several signs will indicate whether the crisis cools or escalates. More flyovers. If Venezuelan F-16s continue to shadow US ships, the risk of a fatal miscalculation grows. Watch for footage or Pentagon confirmations of intercepts by F-35s. The first images or reports of US stealth jets shadowing Venezuelan fighters will signal that the confrontation has entered a new phase. New strikes on cartels. There are reports that Washington is considering strikes inside Venezuela against cartel targets. If confirmed, this would represent an even bigger escalation than a shootdown. International reaction statements from the OAS, UN, or EU will shape the narrative. If allies back the US, Washington may feel emboldened. If they condemn it, Trump could face diplomatic isolation. Maduro's tone. So far, Maduro has mixed tough talk with calls for dialogue. If his rhetoric shifts toward outright confrontation, or if militias visibly mobilize, it will suggest Venezuela is preparing for escalation. The world has seen US presidents navigate tense encounters with adversaries before, whether it was Russian jets buzzing US ships in the Black Sea or Chinese vessels shadowing American destroyers in the South China Sea. But the stakes in the Caribbean today are uniquely volatile. A single miscalculation, an aggressive flyover, a misread radar lock, a pilot's split-second decision could transform this cold standoff into a hot conflict. Trump's words, "they'll be shot down," may have been intended as deterrence. But history shows that when deterrence collides with pride, sovereignty, and human error, the results can be catastrophic. So will Trump really shoot down Maduro's F-16? The answer lies not only in the White House, but also in the skies above the Caribbean, where every maneuver, every radar ping, and every command decision could determine whether this is remembered as a close call or as the spark that lit a regional conflict.